I honestly thought my truck had been stolen. That was the first thing that crossed my mind when I pulled into my driveway late Sunday afternoon and saw nothing but an empty patch of gravel where my old pickup had been sitting for years. I remember just sitting there with my hands on the steering wheel, staring at that empty space, trying to make sense of it. My place sits on about 2 acres just outside a gated neighborhood called Cedar Ridge Estates, a community so obsessed with appearances you'd think they were competing for some national trophy in lawn perfection. My property wasn't part of their HOA, never had been, never would be. That fact had always mattered to me because I liked my freedom. If I wanted to park an old truck in my driveway, that was my business. If I wanted to leave a trailer beside my workshop for a few weeks, that was my business too. But apparently somebody over at Cedar Ridge had decided otherwise. As I got out of my SUV and walked toward the road, I spotted a bright orange notice attached to a wooden utility pole. It was laminated, which somehow made it feel even more insulting. Across the top were the words "Vehicle removed by authority of community management." I read it 3 times before the anger really settled in. Then I saw the towing company's number at the bottom. I called immediately. A woman answered, sounded bored, like she'd had this conversation 100 times already. I gave her my plate number. She put me on hold for about 20 seconds and came back with the news. "Your truck was removed Friday afternoon under authorization from Cedar Ridge Estates Management." I actually laughed because I thought she had the wrong vehicle. "That's impossible," I said. "I don't live in Cedar Ridge." She paused and then replied, "Well, sir, according to the paperwork, authorization was signed by Mr. Randall Pierce, HOA president." The name hit me instantly. Randall Pierce. Tall guy, expensive polos, permanent smirk. The kind of man who shook your hand while already looking over your shoulder for someone more important. We'd crossed paths a few times over the years. Every interaction somehow ended with him explaining what he thought other people should be doing. I asked how much it would cost to get my truck back. $1,200. Cash only. I wish I could tell you I stayed calm. I didn't. I paced my kitchen for 10 straight minutes muttering words that would probably get this video demonetized. But eventually I drove to the towing yard because I didn't have a choice. The truck wasn't just transportation. That truck was family. My father and I rebuilt it together over 7 years. Every dent had a story attached to it. Every weld reminded me of weekends spent in the garage listening to baseball games on a dusty radio, while Dad explained things I was too young to appreciate at the time. He passed away 3 years earlier. That truck was one of the last things I could physically touch that still felt connected to him. When I finally saw it sitting behind the chain-link fence at the tow yard, covered in dust and squeezed between 2 abandoned vehicles, my stomach dropped. There were fresh scratches on the rear bumper. Not major damage, but enough to make my jaw tighten. I paid the money, signed the paperwork, and drove home in silence. That evening I sat on the tailgate with a beer and looked at the truck while the sun went down. I wasn't thinking about the money anymore. $1,200 hurt, sure, but that wasn't what bothered me. What bothered me was the arrogance. Nobody had called me. Nobody had knocked on my door. Nobody had asked a question. Some HOA president decided he didn't like looking at my truck and simply erased it from view. Around dusk I took a walk. I wasn't heading anywhere in particular. I just needed air. Before I realized it, I found myself standing near Cedar Ridge's clubhouse. Their overflow parking lot sat beside the tennis courts, packed with shiny SUVs and luxury sedans lined up under bright white lights. Everything looked neat and perfect. Randall's version of paradise. That's when something strange tugged at my memory. I stood there staring at the lot and suddenly remembered a conversation I'd had with my grandfather years ago. I must have been 12 or 13. He'd pointed toward that exact piece of land and said something that made no sense to me at the time. "Funny thing about that parking lot," he'd said. "It was never really theirs." Back then I didn't care. I was a kid. But standing there that night, with $1,200 gone and my father's truck freshly returned from captivity, those words came rushing back. And for the first time, I started wondering if Grandpa had been trying to tell me something important all along. The next morning, I was in my workshop before sunrise digging through filing cabinets that hadn't been opened in years. Most people probably would have moved on after getting their truck back, but something about Grandpa's comment wouldn't leave me alone. The old man had spent most of his life buying, selling, and managing land around the county. He remembered property lines the way other people remembered birthdays. If he said that parking lot was never really theirs, there was usually a reason. I started opening dusty folders, sorting through tax records, survey maps, and yellow documents that smelled like old paper and machine oil. About 2 hours into the search, I found a metal lockbox tucked behind a shelf. Inside were original family records dating back decades. Some belonged to my grandfather, some to my great-grandfather. Near the bottom was a folded survey map from the early 1980s. I spread it across my workbench and immediately felt my pulse pick up. There it was, the corner where Cedar Ridge's overflow parking lot sat. According to the survey, that section wasn't part of the subdivision at all. It belonged to the parcel my family still owned. At first I thought I must be reading it wrong. Surely something had changed since then. So instead of celebrating, I drove straight to the county records office. The clerk at the front counter probably thought I was crazy because I showed up carrying enough paperwork to fill a suitcase. I spent most of the day reviewing property records, transfers, easements, and development agreements. Little by little the picture became clear. Nearly 30 years earlier, before Cedar Ridge was built, the developer had requested temporary access to a corner of our family's land so construction vehicles could move more easily around the site. My grandfather had agreed. According to the documents, it was never intended to be permanent ownership. It was a limited-use agreement tied to specific conditions. Somehow over the decades the HOA had started treating the property as if it belonged to them. Nobody challenged it. Nobody questioned it. The paperwork simply sat forgotten in county archives while generations of HOA board members assumed the land was theirs. I asked the county land administrator to review everything with me. The woman spent nearly an hour checking records. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and said something that changed the entire situation. "Mr. Carter, unless I'm missing something, your family retained ownership of this parcel the entire time." I stared at her. "Meaning what exactly?" She smiled slightly. "Meaning the parking lot appears to be sitting on your land." For a moment I just sat there. It felt surreal. I wasn't some legal genius. I wasn't a real estate expert. I was a guy whose truck had been towed. Yet suddenly I was holding evidence that the very people who'd tried pushing me around had built one of their most valuable community assets on property they didn't own. The administrator continued, "If you wish to revoke access under the original agreement, there is a process for that." I asked how long it would take. She shrugged. "Depends on paperwork and notice requirements. 30 days, maybe a little longer." 30 days. I remember walking out of that office feeling calmer than I had since the truck disappeared. Not excited. Not vengeful. Calm. Because for the first time I wasn't reacting emotionally. I had facts. Facts are dangerous things when arrogant people assume nobody will ever check them. Over the next week, I followed every required step. I filed notices, submitted copies of the original documents, met with surveyors, paid filing fees. Everything by the book. I didn't tell Cedar Ridge what I was doing. I didn't have to. Meanwhile, life inside the neighborhood carried on as usual. Every time I drove past their clubhouse, I saw residents parking on what they believed was HOA property. I saw Randall strolling around giving instructions. I saw board members discussing landscaping projects. None of them had any idea a countdown clock had started. About 3 weeks into the process, I ran into Randall at a local hardware store. He spotted me near the lumber aisle and walked over wearing that familiar confident grin. "Truck still running?" he asked. The comment was innocent on the surface, but his tone carried a little extra satisfaction. He knew exactly what he'd done. I smiled. "Runs great." He nodded. "Good. Neighborhood looks better without it sitting around all weekend." I just stared at him. That was the moment any remaining sympathy disappeared. Up until then, I had considered accepting an apology if one ever came. But standing there listening to him congratulate himself, I realized he genuinely believed he had the right to interfere with other people's property simply because he disliked looking at it. So I kept my mouth shut and let him walk away smiling. Sometimes the best revenge isn't immediate. Sometimes it's allowing somebody to remain completely confident right up until the floor disappears beneath them. 32 days after filing the paperwork, I received the final approval letter. I must have read it 5 times. The county officially recognized termination of the access agreement. The land was fully under my control. Cedar Ridge no longer had legal authorization to use it. Just like that, decades of assumptions evaporated. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I called a fencing contractor. Then I called a survey company. Then I ordered signs. Lots of signs. The contractor asked why I needed the job completed so quickly. I told him I'd had a long month. He laughed and said he'd see what he could do. By Thursday afternoon, survey stakes marked the property boundary. Friday evening, a crew arrived with trucks loaded with fencing materials. As the sun disappeared, we got to work. Steel posts went into the ground. Chain link sections rolled out across the perimeter. Concrete set overnight. Floodlights illuminated the construction zone while generators hummed in the darkness. I stayed there almost the entire time, drinking coffee and watching years of HOA assumptions slowly transform into reality. Around 2 in the morning, one of the workers looked at me and asked, "You expecting trouble?" I glanced toward the neighborhood entrance. Tomorrow morning? Absolutely. By sunrise, the project was finished. A brand new fence surrounded the entire parking lot. Bright red signs hung every 20 feet. Private property. No unauthorized parking. Vehicles subject to towing. I stood beside my truck drinking coffee when the first residents arrived. The reactions were priceless. Cars slowed. Drivers stopped. Some rolled down windows and stared. Others got out and walked around the fence like they were examining a crime scene. By 9 o'clock, the neighborhood Facebook group was apparently melting down because people kept driving past, pointing at the signs, and taking pictures. Then the phone call started. First the property manager, then a board member, then another board member. I ignored all of them. Finally, around lunchtime, Randall called personally. The moment I answered, he exploded. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I leaned back in my chair and smiled. "Good afternoon to you too, Randall. Remove that fence immediately." "Why?" I asked. "Because that's community property." There was a pause. Then I said 4 words that completely changed the conversation. "No, it isn't, Randall." Silence. Real silence. The kind where somebody suddenly realizes the situation may not be as simple as they thought. Then he demanded an explanation. I told him to come by if he wanted one. An hour later, he arrived with 2 board members and an attorney. They looked confident walking up my driveway. They didn't look nearly as confident 30 minutes later after I laid the survey maps, county approvals, original agreements, and ownership records across my workbench. One by one, their expressions changed. The attorney studied the documents for a long time without speaking. Randall kept insisting there had to be some mistake. Finally, the attorney looked at him and quietly said, "We may have a problem." That was the first moment I saw genuine fear enter Randall's eyes. For the first time since I'd known him, Randall Pierce looked completely lost. Not angry, not arrogant, not ready with another speech about community standards. Just lost. The attorney gathered the paperwork into a neat stack and asked if he could take copies. I told him that was fine. Then everyone stood around awkwardly for a few seconds before heading back toward their cars. As Randall reached the driveway, he turned and said, "There has to be a way to work this out." I almost laughed. A month earlier, there had been a very simple way to work it out. A phone call, a knock on my door, a basic amount of respect. Instead, he'd chosen power. Now power had chosen a different direction. Over the next several days, Cedar Ridge entered full panic mode. The overflow lot wasn't some optional convenience like I'd originally assumed. It turned out they depended on it for nearly every major community event. Weekend tennis tournaments, board meetings, holiday gatherings, contractor parking, guest overflow, all of it revolved around that piece of land. Residents began complaining. Board members started blaming each other. Rumors spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. Some people were convinced I had secretly purchased the property. Others thought the county had made a mistake. A few residents actually came over to apologize for what happened with my truck, even though they had nothing to do with it. One older couple brought homemade cookies and told me they never liked the way the board treated people. Funny how quickly community politics change when parking becomes scarce. About a week later, Cedar Ridge's attorney requested a formal meeting. This time the tone was completely different. Nobody was making demands. Nobody was issuing threats. Instead, they wanted solutions. We met at a small conference room inside a local title company office. Across the table sat Randall, 2 board members, their attorney, and the property manager. I brought a folder and a cup of coffee. That was it. The attorney opened the discussion professionally. He acknowledged the ownership issue, acknowledged the access termination, and acknowledged that my rights appeared valid. Hearing those words out loud felt strangely satisfying. Not because I enjoyed watching people struggle, but because truth had finally caught up with assumptions. Then came the part one had been expecting. They wanted to lease the parking lot. Long-term, preferably at a favorable rate. Randall tried presenting it as a business opportunity. This could benefit everyone, he said. I looked at him for a moment and remembered standing in that towing yard staring at my father's truck. I remembered the scratches on the bumper. I remembered paying $1,200 to recover something that never should have been touched in the first place. Then I remembered the hardware store conversation where he'd bragged about making the neighborhood look better. Interesting, I said, because when I needed cooperation, nobody seemed interested in benefiting everyone. The room went quiet. Eventually, negotiations shifted toward settlement. Their attorney clearly understood the situation better than anyone else. If the dispute continued, questions about decades of unauthorized use could become expensive. Very expensive. In the end, they offered compensation for the towing incident, legal costs, filing expenses, and additional damages. The final number landed at $10,000. 10 times what they had forced me to spend getting my truck back. Randall looked physically uncomfortable when the agreement was signed. I won't lie, there was a small part of me that enjoyed that. Not because of the money. The money wasn't life-changing. What mattered was accountability. Actions had consequences. For once, somebody with authority was being reminded of that fact. After the settlement, they made one final attempt to lease the property. The offer was generous. Honestly, if this had been purely about finances, I probably should have accepted it. But sometimes decisions aren't measured in dollars. Sometimes they're measured in peace of mind. So I declined. Politely, but firmly. A month later, the old parking lot looked completely different. The fencing remained. I brought in fresh gravel, built additional storage space, parked my truck, trailer, and workshop equipment there. The property finally served the people who actually owned it. One evening near sunset, I climbed into the bed of that old pickup and sat there watching the light settle across the hills. The truck looked exactly the way Dad would have wanted it to look. Worn but dependable. Imperfect but honest. I found myself thinking about something he used to say whenever a project went sideways. Most problems don't come from mistakes, he'd tell me. They come from people refusing to admit mistakes. Looking back, that's probably what this whole situation was really about. Not parking, not trucks, not even land. It was about arrogance. The belief that rules only apply to other people. The belief that authority automatically creates wisdom. Cedar Ridge's board thought they could move my property because they didn't like it. They thought ownership was less important than appearance. In the end, that mindset cost them far more than a rusty old truck ever could. These days, whenever I drive past the neighborhood entrance, I still see residents squeezing into limited parking spaces during events. Every now and then I catch sight of Randall's SUV rolling by. We don't wave. We don't talk. We simply continue living our separate lives. But every single time he passes that fenced gravel yard, he gets a clear reminder of what happened when he confused power with permission. And here's the part people still argue about whenever I tell this story. Some folks think I went too far. They say I should have accepted the apology and leased the lot back. Others think I should have pushed even harder. Maybe they're both right. Maybe neither is. Honestly, I still don't know. What I do know is that nobody has touched my truck since. And every time I open the garage door and see it sitting exactly where it belongs, I think about my father, my grandfather, and the strange chain of events that started with one arrogant decision. Now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have leased the parking lot back to the HOA after everything that happened? Or would you have done exactly what I did and kept it for yourself? Let me know down in the comments. I read more of them than you might think. And trust me, this is one of those stories where reasonable people end up on very different sides. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or anyone who thought they were above the rules. I'd love to hear your take.